Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have two gentlemen with me. One is a return guest from long ago. I have on the podcast Nicholas Wolfinger. Nick is professor of family and consumer studies and sociology at the University of Utah. He has a Ph.D. in sociology from UCLA, widely published and cited within academia. And he's also written for The Atlantic, National Review, Huffington Post, and other outlets. He is the author of numerous books on marriage, family, and divorce, including the most recent, which he has co-authored with Matthew McKeever, Thanks for Nothing, The Economics of Single Motherhood Since 1980. Also on the podcast with me in this episode is that co-author, Matthew McKeever. Matt is professor of sociology and department chair of sociology at Haverford College. He's also taught at Rice, University of Houston, University of Kentucky, and Yale. He has his Ph.D. from UCLA and his BA from Haverford. And his research focuses on the structure of social inequality within a variety of institutional, cultural, and regional contexts from the US and Europe to South Africa and Asia. It was a real treat having these two gentlemen on the podcast at the same time. Anybody that knows Nick knows that he is a ball of energy, and he definitely brought his A game. Matt was a true delight as well. I really enjoyed speaking with both of them. It's always nice when you can get both authors of a co-authored book together, and they have just great chemistry, both as guys, and you can tell both on the research side as well. I will say the book tends to be a bit detailed, a lot of charts and graphs and a lot of data, and but it's well written, so it's not too in the weeds. And I have to say, in listening back to the conversation, their two personalities are just great, and I think the three of us really bring to life some of the topics that could maybe be a bit dry in some places. So it was really nice to really bring some of this to life and kind of get people to hear what the data is. So we talk about some of the major causes of single motherhood. Talk about income, workforce change. That's been a big thing in the past 45 years. Teenage mothers, where they all went. It was a big thing in the 80s and 90s, and it doesn't happen anymore. And we talk about low fertility rates. We also talk about the differences between divorce versus non-married mothers, income and family size, race, the 1979 longitudinal cohort that they used in the book, what single motherhood will continue to look like in the 21st century, and many other topics. I really had fun with this one. I could have talked to these guys for much longer, and the research they've done is really important. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So get over there, subscribe, share with your friends. Plenty of similar topics on the podcast that you can also listen to. And now I bring you Nicholas Wolfinger and Matthew McKeever. I'm here with two wonderful guests, Nicholas Wolfinger, a return guest, and Matthew McKeever, to help us take care of Nick. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on the podcast. It's a true delight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Xavier.
But yeah, absolutely.
Please call me Nick. No one but my long-deceased Aunt Beatrice called me Nicholas.
Of course. So you guys have known each other for a while, and you guys do research in different areas, but that certainly overlaps. And you have a book out, which I greatly enjoyed. The nerd in me definitely enjoyed it. The book is called Thanks for Nothing, The Economics of Single Motherhood Since 1980, out through Oxford. And so we'll talk all about it. So briefly, give me your potted bio, academically, professionally. We'll start with Matt first, since Nick, you've been on here. So Matt, you go first, and then Nick, you remind us.
So I went to graduate school at UCLA, which is where I met Nick. And then after graduate school, I did a postdoc at Rice University in Houston. Then I moved to University of Kentucky for a while, for 5 years. Then I moved to Mount Holyoke College, where I was for 12 or 13 years, depending on how you count. And then I moved to Haverford College in 2013.
Very, very nice. And your area of research is specifically where?
So specifically, I do international comparative social demography. So I look at educational attainment, income attainment in different parts of the world. So I've published primarily on Southern Africa, a little bit on Eastern Europe, I have a paper on Taiwan, and then on the United States.
Very nice. And Nick, remind us where you've planted your flag. Where's your academic, professional research, all that stuff?
After UCLA, I went straight to the University of Utah, where I have taught since 1998, studying broadly marriage and divorce. And so have written books about different components of this. If you come from a divorced family, does it affect your own marital behavior? About marriage and religion, about gender equity in higher education and why women get more than half the PhDs but are only a third of the tenure-track professors. And I think the line of research that Matt and I have done predates almost all of that, as we indicate in the book's acknowledgments. The book dates exactly to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, August 20th of 1996. And we could date that because we were in a session at the annual meeting of the American Sociological Association, and someone had just produced a big paper challenging our understanding of how divorce affects women's incomes and economic well-being more broadly. And Matt and I looked at each other and said, we could do what he just did, but do it better.
and that's how this book came out.
That's how this book came out.
26 years later, 30 years later. Almost.
Yeah, almost 30, yeah.
Almost 30. Yeah, usually I say a book takes me 10 years from when the research first starts till the book appears. This was much longer.
Interesting.
But in fairness to ourselves, there were about 5 papers in between. So
yeah. And the death of all 4 of our parents, a divorce, a death of a girlfriend, and many other things.
COVID as well. As well probably didn't help.
And COVID,
COVID and a financial crisis and 9/11, and so I'm trying to think of all the big world events since '96. Right. So
first there was 9/11, then the financial crisis, and then Thanks for Nothing came out. So anyhow, we've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think to put that in some perspective, when I was in grad school, I was reading really the first modern wave of academic researchers on the family. And these were people who, also the first wave of researchers who accepted the Moynihan report, right? And thought there was value in his analysis of family structure. And so I saw this book as continuing in that tradition.
I see.
Yeah.
So let me ask, family is kind of where you're coming out of it, Nick, and Matt, you're coming at it more on the economic lens. I mean, obviously, somebody might ask, like, what are 3 dudes doing talking about single mothers? So it's not, right. So I'm just facilitating here. So I have no real expertise here, but you could answer that, I guess, kind of loosely, but I guess in starting the book, you talk about some of the causes, right? So you can share with us what are some of the major causes for single motherhood. Divorce is obviously, a huge reason, but it's evolved a lot since, over the past 45 years, since 1980. So yeah, tell us what the major causes, I guess, for single motherhood in the past 45 years.
Before we do that, could I interject by saying, fuck that. and stick the knife into standpoint epistemology and give it a twist, right? And I say this because if we had to be single mothers to write about single mothers, who in the world would write about particle physics? Have you ever met a quark socially? Right?
No.
Or perhaps have you ever met George Washington? How do the historians do it?
Mm. Mm.
So
let me give another take on that, which is as is mentioned on the cover. I mean, at the inside of the flap, actually, single mothers were 5 times more likely to be poor in 1980. They're still 5 times more likely to be poor in 2018. It seems like nothing's changed, and so if you're concerned about poverty, but more importantly, we're not just concerned about single mothers. These are the families of America, and so we're concerned about children. And we were once children, so therefore we have the standpoint. But if you're concerned about inequality in America, you have to be thinking and researching on the children growing up in these families. They're overrepresented amongst the poor. There are significant disadvantages that emerge over time for growing up in a disadvantaged household. They're not, it's not destiny, but there are really strong impacts. And they impact the entire country. The economic situation of the country will both cause and then reflect the economic situation of these families.
That's just one of many reasons why so much of the conversation about welfare, broadly construed, is so infuriating, right? People can talk about, is this welfare making these mothers dependent? That's just forgetting who the beneficiaries, the ultimate beneficiary of the aid is. It isn't the mothers, it's the children.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I like both answers, actually. I think I really do. I think that you got to keep I think the basic thing here is that people shouldn't forget about what the focus is here and what the impact is here. And while, maybe my sort of, fun question at the beginning is, something that people might pose, I think the real important thing is if people are doing good research, that's what's really important to understand the implications. So, but yes, what would you say are the main causes still for single motherhood? You can talk about, divorce and, those that give birth out of wedlock, poverty, but what would you say are the biggest causes?
So the first thing to know is that divorce rate is at a 50-year low now. We talk a lot about the divorce boom, what happened between 1965 approximately and 1980. That's when divorce reached those levels of 1 out of every 2 marriages we hear so much about. But
it's declined. It's not there anymore. It's not over 55% or whatever.
Oh, no. It's much lower.
Okay.
So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that over time, the number of children born out of wedlock increased steadily until it peaked at about 40% of all American births. It's dipped a little since then. But what that means is that in 1980, most single mother families were produced by divorce. In 2025, most of them are produced by women who give birth out of wedlock. And widows are a tiny fraction of all mothers in modern times. So we barely discuss them other than just to disqualify them on those grounds.
I see. Matt, you want to jump in here?
I mean, that was the main point I was going to make too. In terms of the causes of what leads people to this, it's actually something we don't study that much in the book. There's a small appendix where we discuss some of the controversies around it. But the way in which families are being created has changed around the world. So it's not just the United States. You see a lot of movement around marriage, around childbirth. And the people who study it point to a variety of factors. Thinking, as one person argues, marriage is the capstone experience. It's not the beginning of the capstone experience. It's not something you jump into right out of high school. As the world has changed, you jump into college or you jump into career and you might have a kid along the way, but you're not necessarily going to want to marry the person you're having a kid with because marriage has to be perfect. And so our conception of marriage has changed drastically. And as Nick's shown in his other research, the conceptions around divorce have changed. With the advent of no-fault divorce, that is in a very different place in people's lives than it was 30 years ago, but especially 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when
Mm.
divorce was an acrimonious, rare event.
Mm.
It's no longer that. And so these combinations of things have all resulted in a really big shift in family structure over that time period that we study.
Let me jump in here
Oh,
before we talk about some of the
okay.
transformations and ask about income. So Matt or you, Nick, both of you guys can take this. But what do we mean by income? A lot of times we talk about family or household income versus direct single income. But when you're talking, as we'll talk a little bit later, about, okay, you have these single mothers that are having certain types of income. What's the most instructive thing to understand about income and some of the challenges that single mothers face?
You want to take?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, technically, income's actually much more complicated the more you think about it. So there's earnings, there's transfers from the state, there's transfers from family, there's pre-tax, there's post-tax, there's informal income and how you count that. Income can mean a lot of things. Households and families are different. Uh, Generally speaking, what you do when you start to look at this is you have to make some decisions about what you're going to study. We focus on family income because family income is the money that's spent on the welfare of the family. Household income may or may not be shared. Cohabitors who both have jobs do not share income the same way that married people share income, for example. It's thought of as usually as separate piles. They don't mix their household finances in the same way. And we look at total family income as a measure of well being for the members of that family. There are different equivalencies. People will divide household or family income by either directly by the number of people or by some function of the number of people, say the square root of the number of people or the square root of the number or the cube root of the number of people. I mean, this gets really complicated. There's maybe as many, one paper argues as many as 40 equivalencies used in the research literature.
Wow.
Family income straightforward. We have an appendix in the book that compares family income to per capita income to some adjusted per capita income. The story doesn't change no matter which you use.
Hmm.
And family income's a much simpler concept. We do use pre-tax income. That's the measure that's in the two databases we use. And that has some issues with it, but for the most part, it's capturing the comparative standing of these families and who's doing well and who's not doing well.
Mm. Let's talk about workforce transformation. Both of you guys can get this here, I guess. In 1980, 57, this is coming from the book. In 1980, 57% of all mothers with children under 6 were working. And now in 2018, that was 71%. And so what's happening here? Just tell us briefly about how the workforce has transformed. You see men's wages have declined. You've seen that they're not as much in the workforce. We're, I don't want to mix too many things at once, but obviously education's a big thing here. More and more single mothers are working. There's been differences in legal and social equality. So all of these things, tell us what's the kind of story we can say over the past, 40 plus years of how the workforce has changed, and then how that applies specifically for single moms.
Well, let me start with this one too. That there's been the trouble with doing this type of analysis is that all these changes have happened at the same time. So as women gained more rights, as they gained economic rights and economic independence, their education was rising in the 1970s. As their education was rising and they were able to work, they were able to get better jobs. They were able to think about careers. And the trajectory for young girls growing up, becoming women as they aged, was looking very different than it had for their mothers. And so you see that is one side of the transformation, which had initially led us to suspect that women's income, even as single mothers, would be improving. On the other side of the ledger, like you say, the men's jobs and occupational standing changed radically. You see strong deunionization in America. You see the drop of the single family wage. You see increasing inequality emerging, especially with basically the bottom of the male income distribution dropping out, really losing pace with the top of the male income distribution. And all of these things come together in either the requirement that women work, whether they're in married households or single parent households, they often have to work in order to maintain a certain standard of living, given the economic changes. At the same time, they have more qualifications. They can get better jobs. They can have higher status jobs. They can have higher incomes. All of these things mean that the nature of income and how a family achieves income have radically shifted. And so these combinations lead us to suspect that single mothers have more opportunity than they did in 1980. And that's one of the things we go out and test and show that it depends on which you are. So divorced women are are seizing these opportunities more than never married mothers are able to. For various reasons, they're older, they're delayed entry into single parenthood, and they're able to work and have better jobs than never married mothers.
So the other thing I would add is just to reiterate how our basic point of the book makes a difference here as there's everywhere else. There's two kinds of single mothers, divorced women and women who give birth out of wedlock. And they're different in every way, measurable and in ways we can't measure. And so in 1980, the majority of women who gave birth out of wedlock subsisted almost entirely on cash welfare, on aid to families with dependent children. And so that's just no longer the case. There's very little cash welfare left in America. There's more food stamps and other forms of transfers from the state. But just getting cash, those rates have plummeted. And so very few mothers get that anymore. And so those mothers who in 1980 would have been on welfare today, more are working, but their rates of employment are still way below what they are for married and divorced mothers.
Do we have any idea as to why that's the case?
So it's an old joke that economists worry about sample selection while sociologists study it. One corollary of this, who just confirmed this to me a couple of weeks ago was Noah Smith. He said that my people are better at estimation. And he said, I agreed with him, but I said, we're better at description. So meaning sociologists. And so we can't say for absolute certain why women who give birth out of wedlock are at such a disadvantage, but we show many, many correlates that are discouraging. For example, those women themselves are much more likely to have grown up in single parent families. They're more likely themselves to have grown up in families in which either or both parents were not working. Their own parents had less education. They were less likely to grow up in houses with library cards that received newspapers. So what exactly this disadvantage or incapacity is, we can't say, but it's there and it's substantial and it affects both their employment rates and how much money they make. Even when women who give birth out of wedlock have college degrees, they still make less money than divorced women who have college degrees. So there's really big disadvantage there. We can't, fully figure out what it is. We actually did do, before we didn't include it in the book, some analysis of IQ. And just there's a big IQ difference there, but it's not, that itself doesn't correlate with race. So there's a big deficit there for women who give birth out of wedlock compared to other women, and we can't fully say what it is.
The thing that seems different for whatever reason that may be is one of them was married, so divorced mothers were married at one point, and then women that give birth out of wedlock were not married, or at least at the time of when they gave birth.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of controlling factor or variable that marriage has, even if you're not currently married, but you were? Is that a variable that could be in the mix somehow, or is that too far to say?
More as effect than cause on that, right? So there really is a big. I mean, this is also just speaks to a broader strain of polarization in America, which really breaks down based on your how much education you have, right? So whether you're a college graduate versus non-college graduate, if you're not a college graduate, you're much more likely to have voted for Mango Mussolini rather than Kamala. Right. And if you have a four-year college degree, you're much more likely to get married and stay married. So this is really one of the most remarkable trends in the family. 40, 50 years ago, there was no difference in education and income and marriage rates and in divorce rates. Now there's a huge difference. Marriage rates have declined only a little bit for people with four-year college degrees, but they've fallen through the floor of people without them. And so marriage is a measure, but it's an indication of a big divide in America.
Yeah, that's a nice way of saying some of the difference there. One thing I was surprised at when I was reading this, it's something I've kind of observed just kind of casually, but we seem to not have many teenage mothers anymore. I mean, I think in the 80s there was plenty of juniors and seniors that were going to high school, going to class, and they were a second trimester or whatever. My mother was one of them.
Maybe you have something you want to confess to us?
No, not on mine, but my mother was one of them. To be honest, yes, she was one of them. Yeah, she was pregnant with me when she was finishing high school. So yeah, this was very common throughout the 80s, but somewhere it dropped off. And so, I mean, I think that's probably a good thing, obviously. But what has been some of the problems? You mentioned it somewhere in the book with these teenage childbearing studies. What's the problems with some of them?
Well, let me say a couple things. One is that the peak of teenage motherhood actually occurred around 1960. So I think the median age of giving a first birth was 19. Now, in 1960, a large number, I'm not sure what it is, but it's a very large majority, were married women. They were getting married as soon as they finished high school. They were starting their families immediately. Their husband was working. They could be prohibited by, it was legal to fire women for being married. It was legal to fire women for having children. And so their husband's working in a manufacturing job, an industrial job with decent pay, can support a family. And that was the modal way of being in 1960. Going to college was much more rare. And that's family form started to shift for lots of reasons. Going to college became more common for men, started to push up the age. It became much more common for women, which has an enormous effect. The more women get educated, the more they delay childbirth. It has a much bigger effect on women than men. And so what it meant to grow up and finish your growing up has radically shifted. And now people growing up are like, I'll grow up, I'll go to college, or I'll get a good job, I'll establish myself. Maybe I'll buy a house, which might take them till they're 120 in the economy today. But that's what you do before you get married. And that's what you do before you have a kid. And along the way, you might decide, well, I'm going to have a kid. But that's the story now. That wasn't the case in 1960 or even 1980. Right? So yeah, it wasn't uncommon in the 80s to be finishing up high school as you were starting your family. It was rare. It was not like it was in 1960. And so that's one big shift in what it means to start adulthood has only become delayed over the course of the last 60 years. So that's one big thing. I can't remember. I had a second point, but I've forgotten what it is at the moment.
David was asking about what happened in 1990 and why the rate of teen childbearing.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Did you want? So one thing that's happened is just a broad decline in everything parents call child misbehavior. Less drinking, less smoking weed. The kids were just fucking less. leading
There's
to
less of these risk-taking behaviors.
Yeah. So what actually happened in 1990, socially, culturally, is as good a guess. Your guess may be as good as mine, because there wasn't one of these big cultural markers like the 60s or 9/11 or World War II that we can really put to the year 1990. I don't think this has anything to do with Ross Perot. But for some reason, fewer unwed teen mothers were having kids. And that was just one of a whole basket of behaviors that was changing starting in that year. Another guest on your show, talking about a book about the family, Melissa Kearney, had a study claiming that the MTV show 16 and Pregnant or 15 and Pregnant or whatever it was. Can't say I watched it. Not enough explosions. But suggesting that show actually had a causal impact on the number of child pregnancies. But then there have been later studies that have questioned whether that's true. So it's not really clear. Social scientists are great at describing the world as is. We're not always as good talking about change over time, and we're absolute shit when it comes to predicting the future. But that that I think has largely been beneficial, because teen moms, when they're unwed, and they're almost all, 95% of them were unwed around 1890, are just not in a good position to support their kids.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting thing. I mean, I fully agree with you. There's obviously something that's happened, and you can describe it and you can notice it, but trying to concretely say this is what it is or isn't is obviously much harder to do. Tell us. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to add. Still, Matt and I have talked for like 3 times, and we still haven't fully answered your original question. So let me give it a shot. So you were questioning what the problem was with these studies of teen childbearing, and a lot of these studies are very clever, naturally occurring experiments. Like, my favorite is one which compared teen mothers with teenage women who miscarried, on the grounds that maybe this was a naturally occurring experiment and randomized selection into marriage. And so there have been many other studies like that, looking at twins, looking at siblings. And these research designs are very clever. But when you're being clever, you're making a lot of statistical assumptions that may or may not hold. Just as there was a paper questioning Melissa Kearney's 16 and pregnant study, there's been a paper questioning whether miscarriages are normally distributed, and therefore the results of that study was invalid. So that's one reason we really stick to description and have very few causal models in the book. So I would say there's nothing broadly wrong with those studies. But they do, at least for our purposes, also miss the boat a little bit, because teenage motherhood is increasingly infrequent. It doesn't speak to the rare number of married women, the 5% of teen mothers who are married. And of course, the vast majority of women who give birth out of wedlock aren't teenagers. They're still young. They're still much younger than other mothers. But if you're just looking at teen mothers, you're just not getting the whole story behind you're just not getting the whole story about who a major component of disadvantaged Americans is. Sorry, go on, Xavier.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's a good point.
Yeah.
So what has increased, well, that's one way of saying it, is the people are getting married much later in life as opposed to 1960 or 1980 or even 2000. People are maybe not getting married at all. And then also, fertility rates are really low. I mean, as far as I know, they're low around the world, which is a big problem. Well, it's a big problem for a lot of things. It's a big problem, certainly economically. And so, what what can we understand about these big trends that are happening? I mean, many people have, again, hypothesized that there are some reasons for this. The economics is one of them. It's expensive to have children. It's expensive to have large families, at least. Some people have cited the fact that there's not as much community support or extended family support, et cetera. There's a variety of reasons. What do you both see as some of the reasoning why there's a dramatic change in the frequency of marriage, or waiting till later, having no kids, or maybe just one kid or fewer? What is your guys' ideas on this?
Yeah, so well, one thing to remember about the number of children you have is that if you want more, you got to start early. And
That's true.
as the number, it's just simple math, but it really matters, because one of the biggest changes with increased standard of living is that you wait longer and longer. You go to college. The end of your adolescence is now your mid-20s. It's not 15.
Mm.
And so you don't start having kids early. The other thing is, why do you need a lot of kids? Right? Are they going to help around the farm? Well, we're not farmers. So you don't need some more people to go milk the cows. You have one or two children, and what a child means has radically shifted over the last 100 years, 150 years especially. Right? Children are not economic assets. They're something else. They're much more than that. Yeah, they're economic drains. And so, so you're thinking, I'm growing up, I might want to have a kid or two, I might want to start a family, but I'm going to wait till I'm settled. I'm going to wait till I have my house and my job and my car and everything's ready. As my mom used to joke, there's never a good time to have a child, but everybody waits till the good time to have a child. And there's never a good time. And so it's really easy to put it off. And you see this, like you said, throughout the industrialized world. Countries like Italy, Japan, Korea have negative fertility. They are shrinking as societies. The U.S. would have that, except we have immigration, and immigration really shifts.
How do you have negative fertility?
I mean, not negative fertility, negative population growth.
Yeah,
negative population growth.
Who's stealing babies?
all those suicides. No.
Maybe there is something.
Sorry, negative population growth. They have such low fertility that the population is shrinking.
Yeah. Okay.
But wait, this is true.
Adrenochrome farm anymore.
This is true. This is true in China as well, right? And this is even
China has a very different system, because the government said you only allowed one child, right? So you had a one-child policy to enforce population shrink, and it took a long time. And then they're like, okay, we're starting to shrink our population. Let's abolish the one-child rule. And everyone's like, well, actually, I don't want two kids. I don't even want one, right? Because now I'm a modern human, and modern humans aren't about starting families as soon as possible and creating large families. That's just not there. And then when you take away state support for parenthood, when you take away family support, community support, when you're by yourself as an individual, or even a couple with a kid, you're on your own much more than you would have been in the past. I grew up in an area where most people grew up and lived their whole lives within like 20 miles of each other. And I didn't grow up in a traditional society, right? But that was the region's, the way the region behaved. Other parts of the U.S. weren't quite that crazy, but it wasn't that far off. Now, that's no longer true. That's not the world we live in. And so people grow up with heavy investment as much as possible in their children, this intensive parenting investment, and their children succeed and go on. I had a taxi ride yesterday, and all the taxi drivers do is talking about his 4 daughters. And this one's got an MD, and this one's an MD Ph.D., and this one is a banker going for her law degree. I can't remember what the fourth one was doing. I think she was a lawyer too. So he and his wife invested in their daughter's education so they don't start having kids until their 30s. That means you've got one kid, maybe two. And if you get divorced after that, then you're a single mom with one or two kids. If you have a kid earlier out of wedlock, you're much less likely to get married. You're much less likely to form stable relationships. You're much less likely to then get another kid. It does happen, but it's really hard when you're spending all your time raising this child to go out and meet a spouse and get married. Even if you want, and you might not want to, this might be what you want to do. So all of these things have led to a very different form of family structure. The economic reasons and the cultural reasons come together. It's impossible to separate them.
Nick, what are your thoughts here?
When Matt talked about everyone he knew being growing up out of a 20-mile radius, I was reminded of the grad school nickname for Matt and his wife. It was the Santa Monica Hillbillies.
That's just because we came from the middle of the country, unlike all you West Coasters.
So I can speak more to the when we talk about two different answers. First, speak to the marriage part, and then about why that's delayed, and then talk about why more children were born out of wedlock over time. So the marriage part, what we've covered in some detail, what people thinking that marriage was a capstone, what you did when all your ducks were in a row, rather than what you did early on. Now, as wages failed, stagnated for many Americans, that meant they never got the place where they really felt like their ducks in a row. At the same time, women's earnings were increasing. And of course, most women still got married, but wanted to get married, but that still gave them the opportunity not to. But that's only for a small portion, because most wanted to be married. The cost of weddings, I'm sure you all know is insane.
Yeah, it's very expensive nowadays. Even a small wedding is very expensive.
Yeah.
And
some people just chuck that and they say, well, whatever. I'm not going to do the big wedding. We're going to go to the courthouse and have just a party and that's it. So some people have tried to find alternatives to this. I've
been married twice for under $1,000 total.
You found the code.
And there's. I was good. Go ahead, Dick. I'll jump in after.
The other thing I was going to talk about was the out of wedlock piece. So as wages were stagnating for most men, wages were increasing for women. For women who were more disadvantaged, as the sociologist Kathy Eden pointed out, children became a tangible accomplishment. Having marriage might seem unattainable. Having good career and economic insecurity might be unattainable. But especially if you live in a poor, less unsettled community, but a child, you can always have a child, right? And that gives, that's a source of meaning, or so I'm told. And they still hope to get married, but it just seemed unattainable. And this occurred, of course, at the same time as the stigma of non-marital childhood evaporated. And, for younger listeners, we have a whole set of language we used to use to describe it that's just gone by the wayside. So when a woman got pregnant out of wedlock, she was in trouble. A man was expected to do the right thing and marry her. If the man didn't step up to do the right thing, she might be sent away to have her child. Finally, just to make sure the man did the right thing, the bride-to-be's father might appear with a shotgun. And that's where That's where the term shotgun wedding comes from. So all these norms to discourage non-marital childbearing just evaporated. Starting in the 60s. I've written about this in other work, and I wrote about it in my book with Brad Wilcox. But before the 60s, there wasn't effective birth control. The pill was invented in the early 60s, as was the IOU. I think the diagram came around along this time. And until 1972, there was no constitutional right for men to for unmarried people to buy condominiums. Enough euphemisms for you? I got that all from Mad Magazine from my seriously, as I wrote about a couple of years ago, when I was in high school, Matt Anderson, the most popular kid, asked me for a favor. Somewhat embarrassed, he asked me, "Hey Nick, would you buy some Jimmy hats?" He was embarrassed because in those days, to do it, and this was in Berkeley, California, you had to go to the pharmacist and say, "Sir, I would like some condoms." And not as easily embarrassed, or maybe someday hoping I'd use the other condom, bought the condoms for him. So that was a whole system, the whole society.
Yeah. I'll still say, even today, they do have it like under like behind a desk, or it's, kind of, you have someone to have a key to unlock it. They do still have that in some places. You can't just pull it off the rack sometimes. It's still the case.
But there was a whole sort of normative and practical system discouraging premarital sex and non-marital birth that's just gone, right? And so by the early 90s is the moment, I think was a watershed moment when Murphy Brown was a single mom on TV, and Dan Quayle in the 1992 presidential campaign dunked on her, and it became a big thing because Dan Quayle was a Republican, and speaking of past morality, but things had changed. And so those changes, coupled with the economic changes and the less opportunity, help propel the rate of non-marital births.
So could you tell a little bit more about the low fertility rates? Again, I mean, today, right? People are not having children. I mean, we could take a small detour here. I mean, typically, if you look at it on a bigger level, at least in the United States and maybe elsewhere as well, you need people to keep having people to contribute to an economy. And so usually you do that in two ways. You do that through good, sound, stable economic or immigration policy, or you do that through having a very robust, kind of baby boom, some kind of way of having it. And of course, you need to provide incentives, or you need to have good, social safety nets. But there are many states here in the United States, and there are some countries that have, what they call a dying or an aging population, where no one's having kids anymore, and it becomes a problem. So you have to outsource people to come work in your country, or in our case, in certain states, or you just have to have more kids. I mean, it does become problematic. I mean, you can have that within 20 years. It can just very rapidly be like, yikes, right. There's nothing here. So what's going on here currently, and what could be the fix here?
So, two things. One is demographers study the great demographic transformation over the course of industrialization, and it's when people stop dying that family size actually increases. So, before all of the things that keep people alive happened, public sanitation, public health, people would have 7 or 8 kids. 4 or 5 of them would survive. 2 or 3 of them would make it to adulthood. Maybe the spouses would survive, but usually 1 or 2 of them would die, and they'd get remarried. And family was much more fluid and much larger, and death was much more present, and life expectancy was much shorter. Well, all of these things have gone away for the most part, right? So the childhood fatality rate is much lower. Birth fatalities for mother and child are much lower. The people will live until they're 70s, 80s, life expectancy really gains rapidly throughout the 20th century. Wars have become more specialized and are less likely to involve the most industrialized countries. So life expectancy has shifted our conceptions of what it means to be a human and what it means to be an adult. And so, yeah, people are having smaller families. At the same time, the world population is growing. Right? So it's not like the entire world has experienced this. Certain countries have experienced it. Rapidly industrialized country like Korea saw the birth rate switch really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's where you have probably the quickest drop in from high fertility to a low fertility state.
Mm.
And so what do you do about it as an economy? Well, you could shrink, right? It is possible to shrink as an economy. The
Not do
bigger
that.
problem is that you have an elderly population which is dependent on state support, and not a younger population to provide the tax revenue for the state to use. Right? So how do you deal with that? People have dealt with it in two ways. They, like you said, they have a real immigration policy where immigrants come in. They might be coming from higher fertility places. They're providing that labor power, and they may become citizens. They may become eligible for those old age state support. They may not become citizens. They may never become citizens. Right? It could be that the state allows immigrants in to support the economy and then kicks them out when they're no longer working age.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way to deal with it. The other way to deal with it is to try to convince kids to or families to have kids. So you aim policies at younger people. There could be state support policies. They could be maternity, paternity leave policies. They could be giant billboards. Like they put up I've seen examples of them in Italy, go have kids, right? They could be housing support. Many of these countries that have seen these drops are because it's really hard to afford your own independent housing. And if you're not living by yourself, you're not making kids. Right? If you have to live with your parents till you're 50, it's much less likely you're going to be out making kids. And so those policies, the cultural policies, have absolutely no impact as far as anyone can tell. Just telling people to have more babies doesn't work. Providing support, especially to women, so that having a child is not the burden. How many women grow up saying, I don't want to be like my mom in terms of doing everything, right? And so you either have men changing their role in the family or you have the state taking over some of what traditionally was in the family. Those policies have more of an impact. But in the end, if you do nothing, you're right. You're stuck with a situation where you have an aging society and not enough people to support it. And that's the problem. But as we argue about with marriage policy, just yelling at people to do something different has no impact. The it's like the flip side of the Nancy Reagan just say no campaign. All these campaigns are saying just say yes. Just say yes to marriage. Just say yes to children. It's going to have the same impact just say no did. Right? It doesn't do anything. We spend tons of money on these types of programs. That's not what pushes the culture forward.
Are you saying that Republican campaigns like that, social campaigns, don't work? Just say no or just say yes. When Republicans say this, it doesn't work either way.
It doesn't exactly. Yeah, it doesn't work. It doesn't work if the Democrats do it. It's just that's not how cultural change happens because some old person is wagging their finger at you and telling you to behave differently. How many teenagers listen to their parents? How many teenagers listen to some old guy on TV saying, behave differently? It doesn't work.
So,
Nick?
So basically the fertility problem, this is getting a little away from the book, but can be solved in one of two ways. You can have increased state supports, or you can change your immigration policy. Both of these things seem eminently doable in Trump's America, and I have no doubt they'll both be resolved in a short order. Until that, otherwise we might be headed to a place like Japan, which has cratering fertility rates and very low immigration. And if you're in the hospital, your family member may be bringing you meals and doing your laundry. It's because there's no longer the staff to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like these are the two ways to do it. I don't know any other way, but, at least here in the States, I mean, people don't really listen until it's at your doorstep. So we have all the warning signs, but, it's frustrating. Tell us. Go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, even paying people to have kids, it doesn't have a huge effect, but it does have some effect,
Mm,
right?
mm.
That's all. That's all.
I
Go
mean,
on.
it should be one of those things where it's like, yeah, if you get, whether it's a, child earned income tax, or if it's, you have certain kinds of incentives, on the tax side, or if there's other social programs, sure. I mean, it's definitely helpful, but obviously money helps, but it's obviously not the whole solution, of course. So you do need other big systems in place, especially for a country as big as the U.S. Tell us about women being more educated, working full-time jobs, producing larger incomes, and how those, this is kind of, I think, overall over the past 40, 45 years, but then what's the breakdown of that, or how there's difference or overlap with married mothers, single or divorced mothers? What's the difference there, I guess, of these dynamics?
Yeah, one thing actually, which also ties back into what we were talking about earlier, in the era where Murphy Brown was a political football, and one of the previous works we did was looking for these so-called Murphy Browns. There were a lot of people making arguments about this new family form, sometimes praising it, saying women don't need men anymore. They can have a baby, they can have a career, they can have it all.
Mm-hmm.
And we suspected and did find that there, of course, are some, but they're a really small portion. Most single mothers are not high flying TV personalities with millions of dollars and staff to do everything. But that's not the reality for most single parents. And so, what's happened with this divide with marriage and education and income is that if you're getting well educated and you're getting a good job, you're more likely to be married. And if you're in this position, you're more likely to stay married. And so higher incomes are accruing more to married people because they're related to all the things that also give you a high income. Having good education helps your income, right? In the modern economy, education is the much stronger determinant of income than in the past. If you're married and making good money and high educated, most likely your spouse is high educated. Women tend to marry men of equal or greater educational background, which means they also have really good earning prospects. So the top of the income distribution for married women is really pulling away from all other women, all other mothers. And so single mothers will be disadvantaged by the lack of a spouse and the lack of a spouse income in their family, but they're also disadvantaged by the fact that they tend to have less education. They tend to have less advantageous jobs. And state support doesn't make up for that. State support's negligible. So it helps. Divorced women have always had higher work participation than either married or never married mothers. And they do go out and earn, and most of their income is coming from earnings. Never married mothers are a third group where they're less likely to be educated, but that also ties into that they're more likely to be never married mothers. That means they have less income. They have lower status jobs. They have greater struggles to make ends meet to care for their children. So, in that sense, despite the fact that women are more educated and getting better jobs than they were in the past, that more and more women are participating in the economy and doing better, they're more likely to be married because those are the things which also lead to marriage. And so that's also keeping single mothers, but especially never married mothers, on the lower end of the income structure.
In terms of education, you're highlighting the point here, and some people might be thinking or wondering, well, why? I mean, I think part of it is jobs still require certain, people that are educated formally, as opposed to not. Okay, so that's a job thing. But also, I think if you look at it kind of on more specifically, if you have higher academic ability, if you have higher cognitive abilities, you're obviously going to be a bit more sought after because you're able to do different things, or you're able to do higher levels of abstractions for things in the workforce. Again, that's not to say that people that don't have college degrees can't do this,
Right.
but does it scale upward as you have more? Okay, you have a 4-year college degree, so undergrad. You have graduate degree, let's say a 2-year terminal master's, and then maybe a doctorate. Does it continue to rise? So as you have more education, you have more income that you're bringing in typically, or is that not quite the case?
It's overall average, yes. It is very typical. Income tends to be affiliated with jobs. So if you have a master's in social work and become a social worker, you're not getting paid as much as if you have an MBA and are a business executive. In both cases, and the thing about education is tricky. Sometimes education is merely a gatekeeping tool.
Yeah.
So to become a lawyer, you need to get a law degree and pass the bar. To become a doctor, you need to get an MD and pass the medical board. So those are entryways into that profession, which pays really well. And MSW is an entryway into social work, which doesn't necessarily pay well, but it is still the entry point. And so education sometimes is an entry into a job. By restricting entry into that job, you can raise the wages. Hence, doctors make a lot of money. Education might also be a signal to employers that you're good at learning stuff.
Right.
And they may favor their old alma mater because that's where they learned their stuff. And so it's a signal. And when you're sorting people, you can't really sort on cognitive ability. You don't know what it is. You don't see them behave. So you just pick the best educational degree. If Harvard likes them, surely they'll do well here. And you see that in the labor market. And then, of course, education has something to do with cognitive ability. You become smarter if you have good education. And that will probably make you a more productive worker. So over time, you'll probably raise up your income. You'll rise through the ranks. You'll earn more money. And so income's doing all of these things much more so than it did in the past. Going into a factory, the high cognitive people were still doing the same job as the low cognitive people. If you had a Ph.D. and you went into the steel mill, the steel workers negotiated a ladder for your pay. You have 2 years of pay or 2 years of experience, here's your pay. You got a Ph.D., that's your pay. You got a 10th grade education, that's your pay. Didn't matter. So that's not the economy we live in anymore.
Right.
And so women entered the economy as it was becoming more of a knowledge-based economy. And as education took on greater importance. And so some of them have benefited greatly from that. And some of them, with those with less education, are on the losing end, just like men with less education are on the losing end.
Nick?
I was going to add, while Matt was talking, I actually opened up our data to look at the income levels for women who give birth out of wedlock. And even at the 90th percentile, that is, meaning that the women who earn more than 90% of the rest of the population, never married mothers, still have incomes of just over $50,000 in 2018.
Wow.
That's really low.
That's very low. That's not
divorced
livable.
mothers, divorce, and that's at the 90th percentile.
Yeah.
Divorced mothers at the 90th percentile are at about 100,000, and married mothers are close to 200,000.
Wow.
So all that's saying is, sure, there are these Murphy Brown mothers out there, these professional women who say, my biological clock is ticking. I'm going to have a kid and raise it myself, no matter what. They're out, but there are very few of them. That's not the typical experience of women who give birth out of wedlock.
Wow. Let me ask about family size. So with the rate of income that mothers bring in. So literally, we're merging the two of your guys subfields here together. What's that breakdown of married and divorced mother incomes as there's larger family size? And I'll let you answer that, and then I have a second question about remarriage and third and fourth marriages as well. But yeah, why does family size matter for a rate of income that mothers bring?
I meant to look up this table. It doesn't matter as much as you'd think.
Okay.
Right. So, we've got a couple tables about income and family size, and really, one child or two child doesn't make a big difference. Having a third child does have something of a difference, 3 or more. But the vast majority have 1 or 2 children. And so while it does impact many things, it's not necessarily impacting income. And I would suspect that's probably because if you have 1 or 2 children in succession, it's going to lower your income possibilities. Over time, as they go on to become students in school and you've got more free time, you can look for work, your income level's not going to be impacted by the fact that it was one or two. Right? It's not a huge transition in your work life. A third child, you're talking about many more years of not being able to participate fully in the labor market, many more years of not being able to attend to your career. That's going to start to impact your income. Even if your career is just a series of low-paying jobs, it makes it much harder to do.
Mm. Mm. Do you think that there's, we've had, many people can recall where there was large families, 6, 7, kids, every now and then I'll still hear people like, yeah, I'm one of 9 or something like that. And now it's like, it was just me, or it was me and my younger or older sibling. Do you think, again, I mean, you gave a nice kind of snapshot or picture of, what that's kind of looked like over time. But in today's society, that would have some impact, right? Of
course,
family size,
yeah.
of what income you're bringing.
It's vanishingly rare nowadays.
Yes.
And that's really the issue. So if you look at income in a situation which might be really bad, but so rare, it's not going to impact the overall story. For that family, it's really impactful. But if you're looking at even the 10th percentile, they're a tiny fraction of that. And so, yeah, a family who has 8 kids and goes through a divorce, that whoever ends up with the 8 kids isn't holding down a steady job. There's just no way, right? So those few families are in big economic trouble. It's unlikely that that's going to happen.
Nick, what do you want to say about family size?
Oh, I would just add that there is such immense discussion out there in the literature of the right income adjustment for family size. Is it per capita income? Is it income to needs ratio? Is it an income of the square root of the family? There's Richard Reeves once figured out there are like not more than like 50 of these income adjustments, and it just doesn't matter that much in a world where almost everyone has 1 or 2 kids.
Yeah, so it's more of a lot of speculating about something that doesn't really push the needle one way or the other in some sense.
Yeah. And so, we actually ran through a few of these in the appendix. Basically just say, okay, it doesn't matter, now leave us alone. Because one of our pre-publication reviewers was all butthurt about family size and whether you should be using per capita income. And we were devoted to family income for a number of reasons. As Matt said earlier, it's what determines quality of life and how the kids do. So anyhow, what were you saying, Xavier?
I was going to ask about, I don't think you're talking about it as much in the book, but what about folks that get remarried or sometimes have 3 and 4 marriages? I would imagine the literature on this is not as robust, mostly because that probably doesn't happen as much as, getting married or never being married or even just one, the second remarriage. But what's the literature look like? Is there any major difference of what is there of people that are married a second, third, or fourth time?
Second marriage, yes. That's well studied. And on the second marriage, when you get remarried, it basically brings your income up, almost to 2-parent levels. As we indicate in our book, at least for the cohort of young women first interviewed in 1979, not totally. So your income, if you had a divorce and then a remarriage in there, will still be lower over the long term. But for the short term, if you remarriage makes the income similar. Second marriages do have higher divorce rates, as I'm sure you know. Part of it is stepkid drama is possible, but even if you control for the presence of kids, there's still a higher divorce rate. And the reason is second marriages are just selective of people who are willing to get divorced.
But that's what I was going to ask, though. You had said earlier in the beginning that marriage overall, divorce rates are significantly lower now. It's not that 55 or 45%. Does that But that's not true. The needle hasn't moved that much on second marriages. There's still a higher level of divorce, or has
It's
that also
still
come
higher.
down?
It's declined, but it's
Okay.
still they're still higher than first marriages, and I think that disparity will always be there.
I see. Kind of
Third
the
and
idea
higher
is
order.
if you could get divorced once, well, you could do it
Yep.
again. Yeah. I
Yep.
see.
And higher order marriages beyond second, no one knows much about. Just because there's not a ton of them.
Sure. Yeah.
When I was years ago writing my first book, this was back in the 90s. With the good data I found, there was only 1% of the population that had actually divorced 3 times.
Okay. Yeah. I had figured it was still low.
Yeah.
I mean, it was pretty low.
That probably, and that was collected in a more divorce-prone period. So the figure is probably maybe a little lower now.
Yeah. Real quick about race, you mentioned in the book. I mean, I feel like consistently we see this. I never see positive data on Black folks and Latin folks. It's always just abysmal data. It's always lower. There's always, it's. What can we make of this? And in the book, you guys talk about that incomes are consistently lower for Black and Latin mothers. Tell us about this. I mean, I'm sure you can't answer the elusive why per se. I mean, we can talk about exogenous kinds of things that are contributing, but like, what are some of the reasons here?
Let me also start by offering a response, something immediately to make you feel better, and also perhaps amusing. If you want a piece about race that will make you feel better, I refer you to something that Brad Wilcox and I published in, get this, National Review about 10 years ago.
Okay.
Which I'll send it, which, shows that the data for the majority of African American men are doing well. It's just the minority that social science repeatedly focuses on. So we're not race scholars. I don't think we have a ton to say, except that to note that when we get into the lower income percentiles, the less privileged single mothers, race isn't making much difference. Right? So you have to. So among the people who just the have-nots, race is less salient.
Matt, what do you? Any thoughts you have?
I got tons of thoughts, but not enough time for. So one of the places I study is South Africa, so I actually do a bit of on race there. But I think that to take up Nick's last point, when you get to a certain level of income that's really low, race isn't going to matter amongst these single parent families. They're all in a very precarious economic situation, and when you're talking about a difference of $10,000 a year or $10,200 a year, that's really not a difference. Now, some groups, when we talk about education, when we talk about where you're located, where you are, groups have opportunities and they don't have, and other groups do have opportunities, both in terms of education and also in terms of what the labor market is. As we point out in the beginning of the book, family structure doesn't cause income because nobody's paid according to family structure. Nobody's earnings are related to their family structure. Right? It's not like you walk in the door and they say, "Are you a single parent or not?" and then set your wages. So wages don't come from that. Some transfers do come because of family structure, but those transfers are increasingly less important. There is a fund available for children. There's a child tax credit. Child tax credit is at most $1,000 a child right now. And sometimes it's been as low as 500. It's sometimes been as low as 0. But that's about it, right? So when you want to look at why certain people aren't doing better, you have to look at why they don't have the economic opportunities in the labor market, because income is primarily determined by earnings still. What determines earnings? It's the job, it's the labor market, it's the location. Everybody knows you're going to make less money in rural Arkansas than you're going to make in Midtown Manhattan doing the exact same job. That's got nothing to do with the person, right? That's the labor market. And so if you really want to understand those things, I would argue you got to look at the labor market and the opportunities available to people. And that will go a long way to explaining what's going on. So that's
real quick on that. Just real quick is you talked about rising wealth and income inequality.
Yeah.
Overall, but that there were shrinking gaps between married, divorced, and never married mothers. Can you just clarify that bit?
Right. Well, the gap is primarily shrinking if you account for the fact that married mothers have two income earning people in the family and single mothers don't. But it's primarily with divorce. So, like when Nick stated, the looking at the 90th percentile, divorced mothers are half of married mothers. So if you figure, well, they're most likely married to someone making a similar income, that kind of makes sense. You've got two high wage earners or one. Where the gap's really growing, especially at the high end, is for never married mothers. They're 1/4 of married mothers. So it's not like never married mothers are just missing somebody. They're missing 3 other people. And so where you find the inequality is especially as you get to that end of the income distribution, where you do now start to see a growing divide between never married and the other mothers.
Go ahead, Nick.
I'm confused when you said there are never married mothers, or a quarter of married mothers.
You said it was 50,000 for never married mothers. Versus 200,000 for married mothers.
I got you.
Okay. So, real quick, you guys mentioned in the last 2 chapters of the book, or before the last one, I guess, so 2 chapters about this National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1979 cohort. Of course, I'm assuming you use it throughout the book, but just kind of, I'll give you a little runway here. What are some of the major findings from this survey? What did you guys pull from this? And, you could talk about single mothers having still disadvantages, family structure, but then also these support systems, such as government transfers, child support payments, co-residence, et cetera. Just talk a little bit about some of the things gleaned from that 79 cohort.
Why don't I go, since I did most of the analysis there? So we use these data as one of the 2 data sources in the book because it allows us to study single mothers over time, where they interviewed the same women annually until the 90s and then biannually up until the present. And while it started in 1979, they asked questions about whether they had married or divorced or had kids before that. So really, this is giving us almost 50 years of data. And since they were first interviewed as young women, ages 14 to 22, we've been able to see if the effects of single parenthood are enduring, right? And what we show, I mentioned it earlier, but is just more evidence of what a class divide there is in America between the people who get married and stay married and everyone else, right? The women, even if they get married and when they were 20 and they get divorced a couple of years later, they never catch up to the over time. Their incomes, they do that in 1980, their incomes are still lower almost 40 years later. And so this is really just speaking to a big divide in America that, we really maps very closely onto family structure. The other thing these data were good for was it not only provided information about all the marriages and live-in partners and kids and education and income of the survey respondents, but this provided a lot of information about the families they themselves came from. And that's what enabled us to say very clearly that women who give birth out of wedlock are themselves from the most disadvantaged families. This is an intergenerational thing. Let me just acknowledge a couple of other studies that were done in the 90s and the aughts that looked at the heritability of divorce using twins, a twin study. And so those studies found that the propensity to divorce has a purely genetic component.
Purely?
Some people are jerks, right? And jerks may map onto personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, which in itself is genetically conferred. So if you're a jerk and you get married and then have kids and you get divorced because you're a jerk and their kids inherit this jerk gene, and then they get married and they get divorced, all for something that's genetically conferred. Now, I can also say these studies show this is a small portion, right, of the intergenerational transmission of divorce, right?
Mhm.
It's only a minority thing, share, but it's there, and so certainly I think this probably has some explanatory power for never married mothers. Above and beyond that, for just the social disadvantages they grow up with, they grow up with a marked lack of cultural capital, right?
Mm.
And they just encounter less words in their youth,
Mm.
and that has an enduring effect on them as adults and their ability, to earn a good living. Consequently, children in America are suffering that don't have to be.
Mm. Mm. The final question I have for both of you, I'm curious for both your guys' opinions on this, is what we're in a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and as we understand economic challenges, social cultural challenges, etc. What can we say about the next 40 years, let's say, of single mothers? What kinds of things could we learn from the last 40 years that we can really help single mothers? Any thoughts or any other things that we didn't mention that you guys want to get in here?
Oh, one big thing I'd start with is that we have had a lot of money by the federal government invested in marriage promotion, in trying to convince people to just do something, presuming that marriage causes economic benefits, and not really thinking about the fact that maybe it's economic benefits that cause marriage just as much.
Hmm.
And so there have been times, most recently during COVID, where we have upped the financial contributions to parents, where the child tax credit has gone up, where there were COVID era payments to families with children. There are plenty of other experiments from other places where suddenly families get income, be it from changing economic circumstances, the creation of a surplus fund in the town, and so the town just starts handing out money to all the residents. People with children tend to spend this on their children, and we can raise child poverty or we can lower child poverty through these programs. If we lower child poverty, we're going to help the country over the next 40 years. If we continue to think, well, these women made some bad choices, let's punish them for it, we're going to raise child poverty. We're going to eliminate direct support payments, and we're going to basically be condemning their children to a much bleaker life. And in the past, the more restrictions we've put on government payments to peoples with children, the more challenging it's been for them to have a good life, to move forward. You saw that with AFDC. You saw that even today with TANF rules. Being able to have a state support the children of that state and move forward into a future which is more promising for everybody pays off. It sounds expensive at first, but it's not nearly as expensive as what will happen to a vast majority of children raised in poverty. If you're raising a vast majority of children outside of poverty, you get a very different society in 40 years.
Mm.
And so that's one of our biggest policy recommendations, is to change both government programs and tax laws so that there's more benefit provided for these children.
Yeah.
Other thing we suggest here is some of just what's to use a very buzzy word, is redistribution, right? To change the rules of society, not so necessarily that not just single mothers get bigger transfers from the state, but just that the conditions facilitate earning. And so we can't do a wide variety of things that a lot of social democratic academics like us hit at, the need for strong labor unions, for instance, and the rollback of Taft-Hartley to make it easier to unionize. The occupational licensing reform, which is occupational licenses. Well, you have one. You're right, or basically cartels for keeping wages down. Right. It's we note with some relish that in Minnesota you have to have a license to be a frog seller. Or is that Massachusetts? I forget. It's one of the two. Yeah. There's just some utter bullshit by, conditions like this, that would attract, what now are low wage workers, would enable them to boost their wages. And so, just as Matt says, this is an investment for, the prosperous labor force going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the things are within a context and things are very interconnected. So, you can help single moms, but, if their environment sucks, you need to have a good environment, you need to have good social safety nets. You need to have, not just opportunity, but that they have access to those opportunities. I fully agree. And these things are important kind of for everybody. Nick, Matt, I thank you both for coming on. It was a fun conversation about an important topic. You both are great, and so I really, really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having us, Xavier.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Xavier.
Absolutely.